Good evening, I'm Dennis Ward. Welcome to a special edition of APTN National News, where we're looking back on the second annual National Day for Truth and Reconciliation. Thousands gathered in Ottawa to mark the occasion. It was a day to honor residential school survivors and the ones who didn't make it home. Here's Annette Francis with that story.
Walk together in peace, understanding and healing.
The opening ceremony started with a prayer and performances. Then the spirit walk from Parliament Hill to LeBreton Flats began. It was a somber event. Thousands made the 2-kilometer walk wearing orange shirts. 24-year-old Naomi Palche says it was an emotional experience.
The whole time I was thinking about the children who are being found, the ones still not found, the survivors that didn't come home. I was also thinking about, our homeless population and our Indigenous individuals who are suffering with addictions, mental health issues.
For residential school survivor Joshua Frog, there was a sense of healing.
I was thinking that I survived, and I'm here today, and I'm walking with my daughter, and she was drumming and singing. The very things that they tried to take away from us, she was doing it. I was so proud. I was just crying along the way.
His daughter, Janine, agrees.
It was really emotional, too, for me, but it was really empowering at the same time, because knowing the things that my dad went through and our family has gone through, the things that we're still going through is still impacting us really strongly, and today we're able to really rise above that.
It was a tearful time for Bruce Kayuda as well.
I got to sing some songs in Inuktitut. One of our members was holding a drum, and we got to sing and drum together. And to see all the names of the children was overwhelming, and there were tears.
With the day and events coming to an end, most here agree healing and reconciliation must continue day to day. Annette Francis, APTN National News, Ottawa.
The former Assiniboia Residential School is the only standing residential school in Winnipeg, and former students wanted to honor the grounds by creating a gathering space. Daryl Stranger was at the unveiling of the space that's been years in the making.
I'm here at the site of the Assiniboia Residential School in Winnipeg, Manitoba. Now today there was a commemorative monument and gathering place unveiled, as you can see behind me. Now there was a good crowd today listening to plenty of survivors share their stories of their experience at residential school and what it means to them to be here today. Now one interesting and unique thing from today was that an elder was able to give us permission to film a pipe ceremony, which normally we do not get the chance to do, and the elder said it was for educational purposes, so that was quite a unique thing for us to be able to do, and it was really humbling to be able to do that as media, to be able to film such an important event.
As our original people, we move forward with our healing, because there's nothing else we can do but move forward and heal ourselves. Heal one another.
Now, the sacred fire that's burning here today and the commemorative monument and gathering place was in memory of Ted Fontaine, and it was his vision that he wanted a place like this for survivors to gather and to educate, the general public on just what it was like to be at a residential school. And there were names on the ground as well. That was also his vision, to have the names of those students who attended residential school here. Now this is phase one of a more broader project to commemorate survivors and those who did not make it home from Assiniboia Residential School. Daryl Stranger, APTN National News, Winnipeg.
In Alberta, about 200 people gathered for a walk with elders, who then made their way through the town of Stony Plain to honor Truth and Reconciliation Day. APTN's Chris Stewart was there.
There were orange shirts everywhere in the town of Stony Plain, Alberta, 30 minutes west of Edmonton. The Walk with Elders was held to honor those who died too young and to move forward with truth and reconciliation. The walk was led by Cree elder Philip Campio. He told APTN what today means to him.
Today means to be proud. It means that we're honoring Truth and Reconciliation. We're honoring the day that the government decided to declare it a holiday. We don't call it a holiday. We just call it a day of celebration that it's time to bring out the truth. It's time to reconcile about what happened in the past.
He says ancestors are here in spirit today.
Our ancestors are guiding us, are helping us, bringing people together in a good way that we move forward. Because how can we move forward without not knowing the truth?
Campio says no one expected this many people to participate.
It's a blessing to see so many young people here. It's a blessing to see so many people. I'm overwhelmed with it. I just can't get over how many people are here today to join us in this walk, and that it warms my heart.
Chris Stewart, APTN National News, Stony Plain, Alberta.
There were many events to commemorate the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation in Vancouver. APTN's Tina House was at one of those events in East Vancouver.
We're here at Grandview Park in East Vancouver, and joining me today is Malikatla. Malikatla, always nice to see you.
Thank you, and it's always good to be with you, and also to see what is happening here today. It's a really wonderful day and a real strong outpouring of the beginning of understanding for everyone of every child matters. And I believe that the more people that we have participating on a day like today, the more progress that we will make toward the goals that we have set for truth and reconciliation to really and truly begin to take place.
Absolutely. Malikatla, would you share with us a little bit of your story and what school that you went to?
Oh, thank you. The school that I went to is St. Mary's Indian Residential School in Mission. I went to that concentration camp they called a school from 1947 to 1952. The thing that I remember the most is to be cold. I was always cold the whole 5 years that I was there, and being hungry because Mission had a systemic a scientific experiment of starvation diet. Aside from the fact of being removed from my family, I had to come from a very loving home and village. It was the singular worst experience of my life, and I've spent a lifetime of overcoming it.
Caught up with First Nations Family Caring Society's Cindy Blackstock to find out what the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation means to her.
Cindy, tell us, what does the National Day of Truth and Reconciliation mean to you?
Well, for all of us this year, we're actually celebrating the theme of resistance. The resistance offered by First Nations, Métis and Inuit people to colonization, and also the resistance are actors in the settler community, like Dr. Peter Henderson Bryce, the Chief Medical Health Officer. So that's a theme we're going to be showing Canadians.
How would you like to see it evolve over the years?
I really want to see it to be really one about justice, about what we need to learn from the past so that we don't make the same mistakes over and over again. With Dr. Bryce, he raised the alarm about the preventable causes of death of kids in residential schools in 1907. The Canadian government stonewalled him. The public were outraged, but when the headlines died, the kids did too. We now have murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls. We still have the federal government dragging its feet on First Nations kids. We could be learning from history and not turning the page on those headlines and holding governments to account.
What's your plan for the day?
We are actually going to be unveiling a plaque at 10:30 on Spark Street in front of James Hope & Son, where Dr. Bryce would have walked in with his manuscript, A National Crime, 100 years ago. And then we will be conducting tours along with the Assembly of Seven Generations Youth Group of the downtown core, really showing all the places where these key people in residential schools worked and the decisions that were made. And then at Beechwood Cemetery, where Dr. Bryce and Duncan Campbell Scott are buried, we'll be doing more historical tours over there. Again, really encouraging Canadians to learn from the past so that they can actually do the right thing today.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Time to step aside for a quick break, but after the break, we'll hear from Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. Welcome back to this special edition of APTN National News, where we're looking back on September 30th, the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation. Our Fraser Needham spoke with Prime Minister Justin Trudeau in Ottawa on the National Day at the event at LeBreton Flats. Here's part of that interview.
I just want to say thanks very much for joining us here today on, I guess, the second official National Day of Truth and Reconciliation. Now, last year, of course, was the first one, and you did make the decision, I guess, to spend sort of a vacation day with your family and sort of miss that invitation from Kamloops. Did you have any regrets about that, and maybe wanted to do things a little differently this year?
Oh, of course. I mean, last year we got to do a ceremony on Parliament Hill the night before, and that was the big event in Ottawa. But absolutely, I wish I'd been in Kamloops for that. It was a really important time. I did go a few weeks later and meet with survivors, as I've continued to meet with people throughout the year. But today was a really, really important moment to reflect on the kids we lost, kids' families lost, survivors, reflect on the ongoing impact of residential schools, and also try and look towards the future with hope as we remember, as we commemorate, and as we heal.
Right, now you've been Prime Minister just coming up on 7 years now. How time flies, right? And I remember that campaign in 2015, seeing you in Saskatoon, and how much you had pledged to reconciliation and how much you made Indigenous people part of that campaign. It's obviously really dear to your heart. However, you become Prime Minister and there's so many issues. Things move slower in government. I guess in terms of that, do you feel a frustration that on some of these files, MMIWG or whether it be unmarked race, things like that we're not further ahead, and that also, do you have some, you wish you were at wish you were a bit further ahead on these issues?
I am hugely impatient to do even more. I think the speed of reconciliation is something that we were always going to have to contend with. It is, as Marie Sinclair pointed out today, what took generations to break in terms of relationships and in terms of community is going to take generations to heal. But there are things that we can and have been moving very quickly on, but there's always more to do, and that's why making sure that as we build capacity, as we help communities come along and figure out what their needs are and respond to those and put them at the center of everything we're doing, which took a while to get ramped up, the pace of change is accelerating, and it's going to continue to.
For every Canadian that we have that will accept non-Indigenous Canadian that will accept responsibility for what's happened in the past and history, there'll be another that resists it and actually becomes angry and refuses to acknowledge some of what happened in residential schools, for example. Now, you're the Prime Minister for the whole country. Now, how do you bring people together on these issues that your government's moving forward, but make sure all Canadians feel part of the process?
Well, the first thing is to understand where people are coming from. While residential schools were busy trying to attempting to teach Indigenous kids that they had no value, that their languages had no value, that their culture, that their identity had no value, every other school in this country was teaching a version of that to non-Indigenous kids. So our communities, our institutions, and many citizens were raised with that mindset, still part of their present, that Indigenous culture, that Indigenous languages, Indigenous identity is somehow worth less than the culture that we have as Canada. And that's wrong. But when people have been taught that all their lives, it takes time to bring them along. And we're seeing every year more and more Canadians stepping up to be part of that path of reconciliation.
Again, to your passion about Indigenous issues, reconciliation, where did this come from? Was it somewhere you lived and taught, or was it from your father, or where did you get such a passion? Because your government has made it a priority.
When I was a kid, my father brought me a number of times to the Arctic to meet with Inuit elders. He brought me across the country to meet with chiefs, and while he was visiting extraordinary corners of the country, I got to tag along. I got to see the amount of hard work that was there to do and that he cared deeply about. And it was only much later when I would get into politics that I realized all the work my father had left unfinished on that. That for all the progress he had made in the 80s, which seemed significant, there was so little actually done it's the continued work to make sure that Canada is the country we all want it to be.
Just ahead of the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation, Catholic bishops from across Canada reunited in person for the first time in years to discuss, among many topics, reconciliation. The Canadian Conference of Catholic Bishops, or CCCB, gave updates on their fundraising efforts, giving land back and more. Amelia Fournier attended their press conference in Cornwall, Ontario.
The press conference opened with a land acknowledgement.
And before we begin, we acknowledge that Alexandria, Cornwall is located on the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee, Mohawk, Huron-Wendat.
In a press release following the plenary assembly, the CCCB also said that Canada's bishops continue to, quote, reject and resist ideas associated with the doctrine of discovery in the strongest way possible, end quote. Despite this, Bishop McGrattan said that returning church land to affected First Nations would be a complicated decision.
Part of what I know that bishops are doing is entering into these discussions with communities to understand some of the history of these land agreements, to understand the history of the presence of the Catholic Church in those communities, whether that be through a residential school or a parish. And I think at this point, as I've entered into discussions locally, I'm starting to see the complexity of this question.
Last year, the Catholic Church said they'd raise $30 million for healing and reconciliation over the next 5 years through the Indigenous Reconciliation Fund. So far, they've raised $5.5 million. In comparison, the Canadian Catholic Church spent $18.6 million total on the 2022 papal visit. When asked why funds for reconciliation couldn't be made available sooner, Bishop McGrattan said it was to strengthen relations between local dioceses and Indigenous peoples.
One of the decisions is to allow for that to be collected over 5 years, is to make sure that the local relationships, the ability for the local communities to identify the needs that will be most important and impactful.
The bishops also approved guidelines for diocese archivists so that researchers and those affected by residential schools alike could access records easier.
I think we are trying to take to heart what Pope Francis invited us all to do, is to make concrete what reconciliation is, and always to do it in a sensitive way.
Amelia Fournier, APTN National News, Montreal.
Still to come, we'll see how those in the north mark the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation. Stay with us. Welcome back to this special edition of APTN National News. Across the Northwest Territories on September 30th, celebrations took place in Inuvik, Toledo, Fort Simpson, and many more communities. In Yellowknife, folks young and old showed up in their orange with the message, "Every child matters." Here's a look at that event.
Hi, I'm Charlotte Moore Jacobs reporting from Sambake Yellowknife in Denendeh. A crowd is gathering for the second annual National Day for Truth and Reconciliation. Behind me, a prayer song will open today's events, along with speeches from survivors, elders, and Indigenous leaders. A little later on, the Yellowknives Dene will host a feeding of the fire ceremony, along with a feast and a drum dance, and stories from residential school survivors and intergenerational survivors.
Canada's plan was to turn the Indian child into a white person, a real Canadian, with your hair cut, hair taken off, your tattoos probably disappeared, and that was the real plan, Canada's real plan. But it didn't work out that way, because I have to thank all those who spoke out about what's going to happen, and those are the real heroes.
Iqaluit residents gathered in the middle of the community to mark September 30th. And for what was a wet day, they got a full crowd. Our Ken Driscoll was there.
a crowd of hundreds took to the streets in Iqaluit to mark Truth and Reconciliation Day. Nunavut's population? 85% of the people are Inuit. That means a day recognizing what happened to residential school students hits hard here. It happened to so many. Jack Anawak is a residential school survivor and led the marchers today. For him, it isn't just the history. It's what remembering that history can do for Inuit today.
It's very important that we recognize the need for more mental health programs and escalate the mental health programs as much as possible over all of Canada, really.
Eva Ariak has worn many public service hats in her long career. Current Commissioner of Nunavut, former Premier, former Language Commissioner. She thinks this is a time for everyone to take notice and think.
And it's so wonderful to see so many people coming out here in the time of day to listen and to learn all across Canada. That includes us up here in the Arctic as well.
Nunavut's Premier was on hand to mark the occasion. Here he is with Nunavut Senator Dennis Patterson. Patterson's on the right in the sealskin jacket. He has hope that this event can help in the big picture of reconciliation.
It's a very important gathering right across the territory. I think really reconciliation has been something where Indigenous people are looking for action, and gatherings like this allow us to be able to reflect back in terms of the struggles Indigenous people face and really where we go from here.
This is the second year in a row that Iqaluit residents have marched on September 30th. With such a large, and by Iqaluit standards, turnout, it's pretty easy to see this event continuing on for years to come. Kent Driscoll, APTN National News, Iqaluit.
A Métis artist in Winnipeg has spent the past year making over 200 clay bowls in memory of the women in her family. Tracy Charette Fair held an event ahead of the National Day of Truth and Reconciliation. Those who attended were able to choose a bowl in honor of a woman in their family. The names of those women were written and will be part of a future project. Charette Fair says the bowls symbolize holders of water and life, much like the matriarchs of Indigenous nations.
There's 250 bowls, and they represent 250 years of Métis women on my mother's, in my mother's lineage. I wanted to honor the matriarchs, the women in the family, because a lot of the Métis histories is based on sort of the men, a lot of the battles, and women kind of often were not as visible and sometimes weren't even named. So I wanted to recognize the women because to me the women are the backbone of the nation.
That's all the time we have for this special look back at the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation. For much more on the day, these stories and more, visit our website, aptnnews.ca. I'm Dennis Ward. Thanks for being with us. Have a great night.